Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in today for a discussion about ending violence against transgender people. And so, of course, from banning trans panic defenses through legislation to providing resources and support to trans communities, we have the power to make this happen. And we know that we need to do what it takes to actually make sure it does. My name is Erin Waters. I use she and her pronouns. I'm a member of the Basic Rights Oregon Board of Directors, and I will be your moderator today. I do have a separate screen with some questions on it, so I might be looking a little bit back and forth. I apologize for that in advance. And today we've got some guests who are going to be talking about this very important subject and kind of giving us some perspective. We've got advocate and activist Octavia Yasmin Lewis. We've got Mickey Gillette, a major gifts officer at Basic Rights Oregon, Samantha Allen, journalist, Claire Hall, Lincoln County Commissioner, and Dana Spears Talbert, sister of Aja Raquel Spears Roan. And so before we move forward, I'd like to give a quick acknowledgement. And while I would give a land acknowledgement, I would rather acknowledge how hollow simply naming a problem can be at times. It's important for us to acknowledge the unceded lands of local Indigenous communities here in the Pacific Northwest, including the Cowlitz, Multnomah, Kalapuya, bands of Chinook, Salesian peoples, and others not named. And so, but what's more important to remember is that as we hear the phrase like decolonize more and more often, it's not meant to be a metaphor. We need to take action in providing direct and material support to these peoples to help maintain their cultures and make sure that they feel that they are included as a part of our nation. And so on to today's subject. When we talk about ending violence, we talk about both interpersonal and state or systemic violence. And so on a personal level, it can look like homophobia ingrained so deeply in our society that people kill transgender women out of fear and shame. On a systemic level, it looks like trans panic defenses, something used successfully as recently as just a year or so ago by a US soldier stationed overseas who's being welcomed home with this country with open arms. And on the state level, it looks like violence from law enforcement. Something happening in Portland right now, today, actually, as this morning, the Red House on Mississippi is facing forced eviction at the hands of armed law enforcement. So before we get into some questions and to get into more information here, I'd like to hold just a couple of moments of silence for some of the individuals who will be discussed today. And their names are Isa Nettles, Nikki Kunhausen, Rita Hester, Lauren Jackson, Aja Raquel Spears Roan, and Chanel Pickett. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's go ahead and kind of get started. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the folks who brought our guests here today, some of the stories that they've worked on, the people that they've known who've been members of their families, and some of the experiences that they have. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some systemic issues like the trans panic defense. So let's get started. Dana, I'd actually love to hear your sister, Aja Raquel Spears Roan, was a trans woman who was unfortunately killed this summer in Portland. And we are so, so sorry for your loss. We know that there are no words or things we can say to really know what you're feeling or what you're going through. But our hearts are with you, and we really want to hear your story. And if you can share a little bit about who Aja was and your relationship with her.
Thank you. Thank you. Just thanking everyone for having us here. Aja was a 34-year-old trans woman. She was the youngest. Well, she said she was the youngest. There's 10 children, and she was close to the youngest one of us. She was very affectionate and loving and compassionate to people. She loved children. She loved to volunteer. She loved to see folks happy. She was also a business person. She was an entrepreneur. She had International Barbie boutique. And she loved to travel. She started traveling when she was 18 years old around the country, and she ended up traveling around the world. She moved back to Portland probably about, I would say, over a year ago, and just really reconnected with family and friends in her community. And her father came home, and he was needing a caregiver. And Aja became his caregiver with the rest of the family. And she really took that to heart. She really showed who she was. And, she spent a lot of time with the kids again. And she got her own apartment, which was really huge for her. And she was, becoming an adult, as she would say. She began to stabilize. I've got insurance. I've got a car. I've got bills. These are big people bills. So she was really doing things that made her happy and made her family proud. And when she was taken away from us on that night, it was so devastating when we received the call that she had been murdered. And I thought someone had actually stole her ID and that person was murdered, because Aja was not a confrontational person. She wasn't a fire starter. She wasn't, she wasn't that kind of person that would harm or try to do anything. And one memory that just plays over and over in my mind, because the suspects who were never taken into custody said they did that murder because of self-defense. And I dressed her. I'll just say that. And she had a lot of wounds on her backside. Does not show me that they needed to be defended from her. She was a big gal, as we called it, a stallion. But again, she was not a confrontational fighting type of person. And so for no one to be arrested as of today, no communication with the police or investigators or anything, everything has just went cold silent, is very upsetting. And it makes me, I don't want to feel that this can happen again. And you can say self-defense because, this person's birth assignment and I feel threatened or any of that. So that's a little bit who Aja was to us. I'm her older sister, and I took very good care of Aja. And it really hurts that I haven't been able to rest or have closure for my family or for Aja. So I feel she sits with me until this closure does happen or something comes up where she feels like we're fighting for her rights. I think that's important.
That is, thank you so much. There's just so much going on there. And this idea that Black bodies are not receiving justice is part of why the civil rights movement has been reasserted. It never really stopped. We're just in a new, louder phase of it. And this time we're coming with the trans community. We're bringing the trans community with us because we won't be left behind. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that and just holding so much. I mean, getting no justice, no resolution is so painful. So thank you, Dana. Well, let's continue. Let's get a little further into. So we're talking about the loss that we deal with when it comes to transgender people. We know that transgender women of color experience some outsized and severely and significantly outsized kinds of trauma and violence and things that they have to carry. So if I could ask maybe Samantha a little bit, you wrote about Rita Hester, who was the Black trans woman from Boston whose killing kind of catalyzed the annual World Transgender Day of Remembrance, which occurs every year on the 20th. We had one that just passed. For those who don't know, between the time that it passed, between that Friday and the Monday, we lost 2 more Black trans women. And so, Samantha, can you talk a little bit about what it was like to work with Rita's family and some of what it's like to talk about the experiences that Black trans women have?
Yeah, I mean, doing that story where I kind of went back and looked at Rita Hester's murder, I believe it was in 1998, and talking with her family, talking with acquaintances who knew her from Jacques, which was the nightclub that she frequented and would perform at. It was such a moving experience because even all this time later, people just talked about Rita like this beautiful light that had been shut off too soon. And it was incredibly moving. And yet there's been no movement on the investigation, no leads, no sort of, no end to that story, no justice, right? And so it was this incredibly moving journalistic experience where you're diving deep into this pain and loss, and at the same time what you're feeling is this frustration that there have been no answers yet. And sadly, that's so often the case with these stories. I think part of what was discouraging about doing that kind of deep dive on Rita Hester's case was realizing how little has changed since then in terms of how local media will handle these cases, how local law enforcement will handle them, how much energy they'll devote into trying to solve them. Sadly, too little has changed since then, I think.
And so again, we're seeing that someone who we lost over 20 years ago, and then Aja, who we lost not that long ago, the same things are happening. We're losing these people. We're getting no justice. We're getting no resolution. And so when we talk about why that happens, there's a lot that we can talk about. So I'm going to hop over to Mickey real quick so we can get into another story of loss, which is unfortunate. So Nikki, you were working with the Justice for Nikki group, who were working to memorialize Nikki Kunhausen, who was a trans teen murdered in Vancouver, Washington, so just over the line from Portland, Oregon. So can you talk a little bit about her family and how they were affected by the loss and how the community has responded?
Yeah. So Nikki, she originally went missing in June of last year, and her family, was really devastated. Nikki was only 17. She has 3 siblings. Her mom especially was really heartbroken, but she kind of disappeared, and that was strange for the family because Nikki loved her family. She would be in touch with them several times a day, so to not hear anything from her was concerning, and people were kind of, bracing for the worst, but hoping there might be an explanation. And then her body was discovered last, I think either the end of November or the beginning of December. And, there were, from the evidence, it was clear that it had been a violent crime. The community really responded to this. Other parents of trans children, also trans community members who maybe saw themselves in Nikki's story, banded together. A vigil was held. An effort was made to pass a trans panic law in Nikki's name. A suspect was arrested, and so effort was made to kind of raise visibility for Nikki's case and to make sure there was accountability for the crime that was committed. But most of all, I got to spend a lot of time with her family, especially her mom, and the two of them were really close. And to be around her was just to see that, we see these numbers and we see names when trans people are killed, but it was the first time I'd been close to someone, and to just see this hole in her life that she didn't know how to fill because this person who she loved more than anyone had been taken from her. That was kind of my big takeaway from that experience.
Thank you so much, Mickey, for sharing. That's devastating. We've got a 17-year-old now that we're talking about who's lost their life to ignorance. And it's so stressful because when we talk about, and again, ending interpersonal violence, and we're looking at systemic violence, it's so challenging because we have this interpersonal violence which is coming from transphobia, which is really just badly dressed homophobia and misogyny in most cases. And now we've got to figure out how to support young people when we still can't even have a mature conversation as a nation about whether or not young people get access to affirming medical interventions. If they don't, are they going to have certain aspects of society simply removed from them, whether it's sports engagement or even just losing access to having partners, because people are going to use this fear, this ingrained kind of homophobia, this deep-seated homophobia, to turn them into terrible human beings and then try to defend their actions. And so we've talked about lives that have been lost, but there are people whose lives are still damaged intensely by this homophobia and this fear. So even if we don't make it to death. So Claire, you were active in bringing attention to the very violent attack on Lauren Jackson, who was a trans woman in Newport, out towards the coast of Oregon, who was beaten in a public restroom. And so can you talk about how that attack affected the trans community in the Oregon coast and beyond? Because it was a huge deal, and we spent a lot of time talking about that.
Yes, it is. Yes, it was. And I'd also like to mention that I am a transgender woman myself and acknowledge my level of privilege as a white transgender woman. And when this horrid attack happened, actually it happened outside of a public restroom at one of our local state parks, but the attacker somehow in his mind justified it because Lauren had used the correct public restroom. And it was really just an awful, according to all the witnesses, an awful attack. I mean, Lauren's skull was fractured, her jaw was broken in multiple places. And, before I was elected a county commissioner 16 years ago, I had worked in news media, and I got a call from a friend, an Episcopal priest, on Monday morning saying he had heard something about this attack, but couldn't really find out anything officially. I started asking questions and got the bare bones details of it. I accessed the police report, but neither the local police department nor district attorney's office were interested in publicizing it. So the two of us basically said, "Oh, no, you don't." And luckily, again, because of my community connections, and we were really able to get local news media, the local LGBTQ community mobilized, Portland news media, and the light was really brought to bear on this awful incident. And at least fortunately, justice was done in the sense that police were able to apprehend the attacker within a few hours, and our district attorney did choose to prosecute this as a bias crime. I believe it was one of the very first cases after the updating of Oregon's bias crime law that year, where a bias crime was charged in an attack on a transgender person. And so, if anything, if there can be any good outcome over something this horrific, as we were kind of debriefing in the weeks and months after, we thought, yeah, gee, everything fell into place. Media, law enforcement, clergy. But we said, what if in some small community, you didn't have one of those elements in place? So, it was an object lesson, and I think Lauren was an amazing beacon to all of us. There were 2 large community rallies to support her, and she actually was able to come to the second one, and she offered this beautiful message of forgiveness to her attacker, which I think was the thing that really resonated with people. But equally amazing and beautiful to me was her talking about unconditional love for self and for others. So, I had a couple of people say to me, "Oh, Lauren is so lucky that she had you to help shed light on her story." And I said, no, I am the lucky one to have had this beautiful, amazing soul come into my life and to be able to help her in even a small way.
Wow, thank you, Claire.
You bet.
So that is absolutely amazing. After dealing with a broken jaw, she still expressed no anger. And that isn't everyone's way. It is for some people, it isn't for everyone. I'm really glad that she was able to find a place in her heart where she could speak in favor of her transition and in favor of loving people, because we do know that this is all sourced from ignorance. But we can look at the amount of pressure that it took. Otherwise, that good old-fashioned systemic ignorance, the minimalization, the gaslighting that this isn't a big deal or that we don't have to worry about it would have been present. And that's a form of violence, right? It's
definitely. Yeah, this could have very easily been swept under the rug. And, not only am I, somewhat prominent in the community as a county commissioner, but a few years before me, a former journalist, teacher, who was really prominent in the Lincoln City area, she transitioned as well. So we talked about how, in a way, for kind of an isolated coastal rural community, that people were at least somewhat maybe more attenuated to the reality of trans lives than they might be otherwise. So, that was maybe another thing that fell into place. Just the level of community shock, outrage, and I think some positive pressure, if there was any reluctance on law enforcement's part at all to pursue this. I think enough light had been brought to it by enough people that couldn't have happened here, but it easily could have happened in another community.
Wow. And so as we talk about all of this violence that's heaped upon our communities, from Aja to Nikki to Lauren to Rita and to Chanel Pickett, who was a woman in Boston who had the trans panic defense successfully used. So her murderer used it to avoid more serious charges, which is something that Samantha actually reported on as well. And so what I'd like to do is kind of move us into a conversation about justice and accountability, because no justice, no peace. There's a reason we say that. NO justice, NO peace. And when we know KNOW justice, we will KNOW peace. And so we have to continue talking about these things. We have to continue making space. And one of the reasons it's so important is because these things aren't deep in the past. Some of these things are pretty recent. And just a couple of weeks ago, 2 judges in Florida actually said that conversion therapy for minors is acceptable again on First Amendment rights, religious grounds. And for those of us who have looked at the science, who have looked at the professionals and what they have to say about it, we know that it doesn't work. Conversion therapy not only doesn't work, it actually makes an even more suicidal community even more suicidal. And so what we're doing is we're saying that if some part of our culture just doesn't agree with you, we can psychologically torture you as a child to try and get you to conform to these spaces. And so we can talk about the pathology of fear and just how comfortable this nation is when it comes to fear, when it comes to things like the trans panic defense and how it's used. And as we talk about the trans panic defense, we have to talk about its origins, right? This is about partner violence, intimate partner violence, people who know these individuals and people who don't know these individuals, who are, again, getting badly dressed in homophobia and misogyny to engage in an active, violent, virulent transphobia. And so what I'd like to do is, Dana, do you think, are there words that you have about whether it's our culture and our complicity in supporting people who freak out over the trans community's very existence and do damage to them? Like, do you have thoughts that you can start off this conversation with for us?
Just thinking about this and thinking about Aja and the community that she comes from, people have to really be comfortable with themselves, and doing harm to someone, no matter what their sexuality preference is still doing harm to a human. And if you have any type of self-awareness of yourself, you could be prejudiced against for any sorts of reason. And making it about your sexuality does not give you cause, does not make it okay, does not say, okay, I can do this to this person because they're Black, or because they're trans, or because, and that list can continue on. And where do we stop? Where do we say, okay, there has to be a line and we need to identify with that? And no, we can't. Don't torture me to make me change my thinking or my mind. This is the person. And it was very hard for our family at first to accept Aja, but I had to remember Aja is still the same person. Aja is still my sister. Aja is still 6 feet tall. Aja is still that funny person. Aja still has my genes, my traits. Aja is still a part of us. And how do we learn to accept her? Because I'm Christian, and it was like, don't, yes. And I had to come to a place where I'm comfortable. So that's one thing that I would encourage is folks finding their comfortability. Where are you comfortable? If that's even a word. Where are you comfortable at accepting, and what can you do to start removing those biases and learning to love that person as a human, as a community member, as whatever they are?
Yeah, so can you go a little more? What is it like for the community to lose someone like Aja, yet another Black trans woman? If we talk about the 330 million people in the United States and the number of actual Black trans women, it's losing a member of a literal handful of human beings.
It was hurtful. There were a lot of folks that reached out to the family. There were a lot of events, on behalf of Aja. And then people start to reflect, like her social media, like this was Aja. This is what Aja liked. Aja was a human. She loved food. She loved kids. She loved things that I love. She loved things that you loved. And now that is gone, there is a big piece missing. There's a piece and it starts to go generational, because now my daughter, who's 13, who was very, very close to Aja, starts to have like, why do people kill? Why did they kill her? Why? She did not know that Aja was trans. And now all of this has opened up. Well, was it a secret? it just starts to really make conversations have to come out and really have those conversations with younger generations, with younger kids, with older family members of, yes, she was trans, but again, this is Aja and this is what she loved. And how do we continue to make her a part of our family? True, there's folks that still don't accept, but they accept Aja. And as you say, if you accept me, you have to accept all of me. And that's what we really want to see. So the community has suffered a great loss. She is remembered by the things she did, by the things she started, by who she was, and we would like to keep that going. But we'd also, again, like to know, what happened and bring some closure, some justice to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dana.
Mm-hmm.
So now as we talk about what we've lost and what we lose when we lose these community members, we have to talk about how do we change this? How do we make functional change? Like I said earlier, we can name the problem, but naming the problem is literally the first most basic step. It's not, it's education is an activity, but is it really an action? And so when we talk about action, let's talk about the Trans-Panic Defense specifically in regard to it being unjust and its effects on the community. So Samantha, you wrote about Chanel Pickett in Boston, and again, someone successfully uses the Trans-Panic Defense in that situation. And Rita Hester talked about the concerns that she had in regard to that leniency, that complicit in our culture of being okay with some of these things, at least to some degree, that it's okay to be so afraid of trans people you're willing to take their lives. What do you think the effects of banning the Trans-Panic Defense are going to have? What do you feel how is that going to make the community more safe?
Yeah, I mean, I believe Rita even said at a rally before she was killed something to the effect of like allowing people to use the Trans-Panic Defense is only going to encourage more violence against trans people, because it instills in the legal fabric of our country that trans lives are disposable, that you can take a trans person's life and get away with it because you can just say, oh, I was threatened, or I didn't know, or I was in a stupor, a panic, or a daze because I just discovered this person's gender identity. When that's illegal in, I believe, 40 states in this country, it sends a really clear message that it's okay to dispose of trans life, and that's a harrowing thing. I mean, I think we all know that we live in a country that doesn't value our humanity. If you look at the kind of legislation that gets proposed, if you look at the kind of stigma that we deal with, and to me, the Trans-Panic Defense, it's one piece of this kind of broader framework. If we like the underlying causes of this violence that often like don't get picked up or reported in detail in like early local media reports, there are all of these structural causes. Trans people we're so much likely to employment, poverty, homelessness, all of these factors combine to put us in situations, especially the more marginalized in our community, in situations to experience interpersonal and sadly often fatal violence. But at the root of all of that is this underlying stigma that we keep returning to, just this idea that trans life is disposable, because that's the idea that puts trans people on the streets. That's the idea that gets us fired, and that's the idea that makes it legal to claim that you killed us because you were afraid. Yeah.
So that's so stressful, just to think that if I got into a fight or someone tried to hurt me, they could justify that by saying, oh my gosh, she was trans. And you're right. This idea that if we allow it, it will promote a certain type of violence because, well, this is your get out of jail free card. Our nation's homophobia, transphobia, all of these phobias and isms, this is your get out of jail free card or get out of serious charges free card. Thank you so much. And so for those of you who don't know, you can go to lgbtmap.org and actually see some of the state laws, whether it's conversion laws or so on and so forth. 36% of the community live in states that prohibit the use of legal defenses claiming the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity contribute to their actions. But 64% of the population do not prohibit the use of legal defenses claiming that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity contribute to the defendant's actions. So over half the country, well over half the country, is in a position in which they can actually just say, I was scared. And we see that reflected in law enforcement. What do they say when there's a racial issue or there's a moment of racial injustice? I was afraid. I was so afraid of this person that I feel justified in taking their life in order to satisfy my fears. So if we talk about the benefits of removing these laws and changing the culture and its overall effects, we have to talk about the legislation itself. And for that, we can turn to Mickey and Claire. Claire, you are a legislator. Mickey, the Justice or the Nikki Kunhausen Act was involved in banning the trans panic defense in Washington. So maybe, Claire, could you start with talking about, from your position as a county commissioner in Lincoln County, what are the steps you think legislative bodies like the ones you serve can do to make people more safe? And then Mickey, if you can kind of follow up with what that looks like in practice in actually getting this passed in Washington, that'd be great.
Well, I can say, from a county government level, certainly we have adopted resolutions, public statements, and maybe most importantly, I think workplace policies that are, I would say not just inclusive, but almost aggressively inclusive. As an advocate on a variety of social justice issues at the legislature, I was asked to weigh in on the 2019 bill that broadened the Oregon bias crimes law, among other things, to include trans people for the first time. And I was really heartened and frankly a little bit amazed, but maybe this is one small statement of how far things have progressed, that I don't think there was one negative vote in either the House or the Senate. I give huge thanks to Ellen Rosenblum, our Attorney General, for really spearheading this update. As maybe many people already know, that Oregon did have one of the earliest bias crimes laws dating back to the 1980s, but that was a time apparently when gender identity-based assaults were at least not publicly recognized as a significant issue. So that was one important victory that was won, without significant pushback. And I think, maybe the time is here, as soon as next year to encourage this next step in the Oregon legislature.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. This year, the bill has passed, an LGBTQ panic defense ban has passed in Washington.
Right.
The bill had stalled out the previous year. It had been introduced, but didn't get out of committee. And I think it was Nikki's death and the attention that was brought to it by the Justice for Nikki folks that helped put the spotlight on it in the legislature there. Her local rep, whose name unfortunately I'm forgetting, she really championed the bill. She helped get it through the Senate and then through the House where she serves. And it was signed. Nikki's mom and some other Justice for Nikki folks were able to speak at hearings, and I think that helped people understand the importance of the bill. I know several times when I was with Lisa, she talked about just how unbearable it would be if the person accused of killing Nikki tried to use this defense to say, I did this, but there was a reason, and you should understand this reason, because, there's no reason to explain what happened to Nikki. And that we're planning to introduce a bill like this in next year's legislative session. Basic Rights Oregon is to help get this law passed in Oregon. And sometimes we'll hear from people who say, well, this defense is so rarely used. Why do we need to pass this law? Isn't this trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist? And it just upsets me. It just shows kind of what you're talking about, Aaron, this ignorance that exists. Because trans people are still killed for being trans. Like that's a problem that does exist. And, you know, the idea that the loved ones of a trans person should have to hear someone who commits a crime against them use this excuse is painful. But also, you know, what Samantha said about trans people being seen as disposable in our culture. This is one way that a state can say that's not the case. The state can affirmatively say there's no excuse for harassment, assault, violence, murder against a trans person. And we're saying that with our voice. This is the state creating a law to say that trans people are equal under the law. And I think that, you know, that's so valuable and so important. And I wish that went without saying for people, but unfortunately we still have to do the education to make sure that people do understand that.
That's so true. Every time I hear this idea that, well, we don't need this, it doesn't happen here, I'm reminded of some of my first experiences moving to the Portland area from Southeast, which is Georgia. And people saying, oh, well, racism isn't a big deal here. And except, no, it is. It's just that people here feel more comfortable thinking it isn't happening because they're not seeing the community the same way. They don't see as many Black and brown folks, so they think that racism isn't as bad. When it's about our reporting, not actually reporting on some of these issues. We lost TT Gully, and she was found swinging from a tree like strange fruit in East Portland, and there's no justice there. It came down to someone who was fluid and open and engaged, and they're saying, well, we found her from a tree, clearly she must have committed suicide. They don't have to worry about justice. So they've got these downstream effects when we don't, as a state, when we don't as a community take these firm stances against these issues. We could step up, but instead of stepping up, we are just sitting by. And, well, we want to wait until someone is harmed. And that's really frustrating to hear. You hear that in the corporate world. Well, we have to establish need, right? Or our legal system is based on who's being harmed. So until someone is being harmed, they're not willing to move forward. But we see people being harmed left and right. We see people being gaslit by their neighbors. We see people being ignored by the media. So finding spaces to actually take these steps is absolutely critical and absolutely crucial. And so this is some good space. We've kind of set the stage, and we've talked a lot about some different methods of handling the state issue. We've talked a little bit about handling the interpersonal issues. And so what do we think is left? What do we think are more steps to take, and not just in a legislative sphere, as we realize we have to continue to do the social kind of work as it relates to conversion therapy and finding ways for our culture to get beyond the binary. So when we talk about getting beyond this binary and making space for trans people, what do we think are some good steps? And so I think let's start with Claire. So we talked about some legislative steps. From your standpoint as a transgender person, what are some things that you will need to see personally in order for you to start having faith in your neighbors in the community, or take your life seriously and they want to see equal justice for you?
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty heavy one. And I know that my experience has been so not typical. I mean, I've gotten a little bit of distant echoes, I would say, of transphobia, the usual, I'm a mentally ill man in a dress kind of garbage. But, you know, I'm an optimist by nature, but, you know, 2.5 years ago when I finally decided I had to start living my truth, the number of people, you know, who, you know, there were a lot of people who kind of, I think their attitude was, well, gee, I really don't understand this, but if this is what you need to do to be happy, all the best to you. But the number of people who have been so remarkably affirming and supportive and saying, you know, I want to know more about your journey. I want to understand what it's like. So I've really taken advantage of every positive public forum that I've had, you know, service clubs, all kinds of churches, all kinds of platforms to tell my story, but also try to help people understand how untypical it is and how I have not faced the job discrimination, the poverty, the violence, and just, try to make them aware that society treats most transgender people indeed as if, they are disposable objects and not human beings, and appealing, at least I feel like maybe I've planted a few seeds and a few hearts and maybe opened a few eyes, but I think that's what, we need 1,000 voices doing this. We need 10,000 voices. We need 10,000 times 10,000. And Bethany, my friend who I mentioned earlier, she's been very active as well. But we've talked about how, for so many cases, that for reasons that I don't think will be a surprise to anybody here, and you've lived it, or somebody very close to you has lived it, it is not safe to step forward and be public. So, I just think every route possible, every platform, to tell the million stories of transgender Americans. It's just going to be a constant, never-ending process, and I think it really is going to come down to changing one mind and one heart at a time.
Thank you. Yeah, that speak up concept, that we have to take it upon ourselves each and every day. We're doing that when we talk about racial justice. We're doing that as we talk about ableism. We're learning how to talk about bodies of different sizes with respect at all levels. And so all of this work really feeds into itself. And it's important to remember that none of this exists in isolation. We can't just save trans people. We can't just save the Indigenous community or the Black community or the Asian. We really have to work together to find out the unique needs of these individual communities and find ways for them to engage. So, Nikki, can you talk a little bit about some of the youth perspective, especially since you worked with, the Justice for Nikki group, and what do young people need as we are going to re-enter a world in which conversion therapy is considered acceptable?
Yeah, I can give that a try. Let's see, I guess I feel two ways. I actually transitioned while I was substitute teaching, which is not something I would recommend to anybody because it was very hard. Substitute teachers are already not treated super well, and then you throw something that kids don't understand on top of that, and it was a real scene. But I feel like kids understand it better, especially the really young kids, if they're seeing kids transition around them, elementary school, youth. I think that can be so helpful. So I think the young people around us are growing up in a world that's just going to be less ignorant. And it still will be hard because being an adolescent is always hard, but I feel like the experience they're having is probably going to be easier than, the one that some of us might have had. On the other hand, I think it must have been so difficult to live through the past 4 years of this administration that has just done everything it can to stigmatize and steal rights from the trans community. I don't think anybody could be immune from just feeling that in the atmosphere, even in a place like Portland. We're at Bro, we fight for trans students every day. Just this week, we got the good news that a case that we've been fighting against some very, conservative, bigoted parents who want to remove protections for trans kids in Oregon schools was not taken up by the Supreme Court. So it looks like it's officially dead, and that's great to see. I don't know. I worry about that ruling in Florida. Like you said, there was a three-judge panel, and the two who voted to strike down the conversion therapy ban were both Trump appointees. And if you've been following the federal judiciary, there's lots of Trump appointees out there. And so this could be the first of many rulings like this. Oregon banned youth conversion therapy in 2015, and I hope that ban will stand, but it could be in jeopardy now. I feel like if you know trans people, you need to speak up in favor of them. Those of us who have some privilege and have a voice need to share why this is important to people around us who might not know it. When I think about why I do the work I do, it's always for the younger people, because I want them to have a better, easier life than I do, and that's why I feel like it's important to show up in the way that you're talking about.
Yes, thank you, Mickey. Yes, you're correct about those judges. They were Trump appointees. For those who don't know, there have been a significant number of those kind of rammed through very, very successfully. A lot of these judges come from an organization called the Federalist Society. They are well aware of what they are doing. They were well aware of the language that they used when they made this ruling and how it could affect really every other ruling in the country around conversion therapy. And so we have to make sure we're having those conversations, because like Mickey said, young folks are coming up in a different environment. It's different for them. They're learning that we can be more gender expansive, we can be more engaged, that we don't have to be as rigid as we once were. And we are starting to see more and more people really start to decolonize themselves, in the sense that we can see that Indigenous individuals with two-spirit identities, whose identity is raised up in the culture we have that is based in whiteness and white language and white supremacy. And so if they're able to build their identities outside of those spaces, what can we learn from that? Not only how can we support them, but what can we learn from that? If we have family members who speak Indigenous languages from places like Africa, in Yoruba, there is no gendered pronoun. And so there are different spaces in which different cultures engage with gender differently. And it's really important for us to try and find some ways to expand those conversations and deepen those conversations where we sit. And so, Samantha, you're a journalist. You've talked to lots of different people. I'm sure when you see the news, you see the media spinning things, you have an understanding of what's happening behind the scenes. Can you talk a little bit about not just where this comes from, but how the media is not only complicit, but supportive of some of these negative positions when it comes to writing stories or the language that they use? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think often local media, when they report on anti-trans violence, just goes off the police blotter or like a police press release. Doesn't bother to kind of like cross-check with the community whether, often in the police report, the victim will be misgendered, it'll be identified, like the case will be reported as like man in a dress found shot or like knifed to death on the street. And then a local media outlet will run with that. And then people in a community will recognize the victim and bring it to law enforcement's attention. Law enforcement oftentimes, sadly, will even then not correct how they're gendering the victim. And it just goes from there. And then from a national media perspective, the cases often get reported on in a sensationalizing way that just kind of centers the violence and not the actual humanity of trans people. And so I see that as kind of a recurring chronic problem of just, national media outlets being like, look at this horrific act of repeated stabbings or multiple gunshot wounds. Isn't that terrifying and horrible? And of course it is, but what gets lost are details like what we've heard on this call about Asia, like just the humanity and like the love that trans people had for their families, for their community, and the love that their communities often had for them. So to me, like that's where I feel like journalism comes in, where journalism really needs to step up and shape up. When I think about reducing anti-trans violence, I think about the law, right? Changing the trans panic defense to be illegal, banning conversion therapy. I think about justice, like, taking some of these structural inequities that trans people face and working to address them through political action. But suffused through both of those things is the culture of transphobia. And to me, the way that I, as a journalist, and that my fellow journalists can kind of try to chip away at that is by affirming the humanity of trans people and telling stories that shine a light on that.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, sometimes when we talk about, for example, the Indigenous community, all we do is talk about the sad parts, right? Things that have been lost. And the negative history. And there's some different ways that we can engage that we can uplift. So in that spirit, we have about 8 minutes left. Let's hear some words from these folks if they were here today. Some of us are folks who either knew them best or know their families. And so let's hear some words from them if they were here with us today. And so I would love to start with Dana. If Aja was here with us today, what do you think she would want us to know? What type of things do you think would be important for her to know that we have heard?
I think it'd be important to know that she was human, that she was a trans woman, that she was proud of who she was, that she was hurt, that she didn't like violence, she didn't like confrontation, that she wanted everybody to be happy, that she wanted her rights to matter, that she wanted the hard work from talking to her family about who she was to showing who she was. She wanted all of that hard work to matter. And the only way that it would matter is that if people respected her, if her crime was solved, if anything happened to Aja, she get to the bottom of it. What happened? How do we fix this? Aja would want that. She wouldn't want this to happen to anyone else. So how can we stop this from happening to anyone else and being swept under the rug? I think Aja would really want, she was a very flamboyant, outgoing person. And she would really want people to solve, like I said, the crime, but also to take her at heart, take other people at heart, and really get to know people and not know them for what you visually see, but know the entire person.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dana. Thank you for those words from Aja. Mickey, let's talk about Nikki Kunhausen. What are some things that you think she would want us to know as we part today?
Yeah, Nikki was a really strong person. She was kind of fierce. She grew up with brothers who didn't understand her and told her, you can't wear that, you can't do that. And, from what I was told from the very beginning, she was like, yeah, I can. And and she would beat them up if they tried to, stop her. I'm sorry about that. And she, kids tried to bully her at school, but she was able to handle that. What I was told is that she became kind of a champion whenever she saw bullying happening around her. She would stick up for the underdog, I think because she had experienced that kind of pushback in her life. Her mom said she was everybody's hero. And so I think she would second everything that we're talking about, say this world has to change. It has to be better. There shouldn't be people who are looked down on for who they are and people who get away with trying to hurt those people. I think she was someone who was really kind of adamant about, protecting people and making sure there was justice.
Thank you, Mickey. Nikki will definitely be with us, especially for those of us who spend time on both sides of the river. We do what we can to carry her. Okay, Samantha, you're up. So talking about Rita, talking about Chanel, what are some things you think are important to know from their eyes or their perspective?
Yeah, when I think about the conversations I had with Rita Hester's family and friends, again, like what struck me the most was the light that she brought into their lives. And in subsequent reporting that I've seen on Rita Hester about, the 20th anniversary of her death or that kind of thing, that theme continues to crop up in the large circle of acquaintances and friends and family members that reporters are continuing to talk to. And I think about one, I believe it was her nephew who said in a 20th anniversary article about Rita that it was always better to have her around than not around. And, I think that's I wouldn't presume to speak for her, but I think that's a message that she would want us to take away, is that it's always better to have trans people around than not around, and I hope one day we can live in a culture and a society that recognizes that.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So Claire, we've heard a little bit about what Lauren might tell us if she was here. But with the couple of minutes or so that we have left, could you speak to that again about, how it's really going to be through love and support and finding ways to actually affirm each other that we are going to find a way forward that is based in justice?
Mhm. Yeah, I wish I knew more about Lauren's story, but I can share a bit more. I mean, this attack literally took place just days after she arrived in Oregon. What she told me was, and I know this is certainly far too typical, she had been living in Utah, and as she put it, her life just kind of blew up in Utah, and she decided to make a new start in Oregon. She had never been to Oregon, but she had heard wonderful things about Oregon. And again, despite what happened to her, she said she was so glad she came to Oregon because she did find not only in Newport, but then also in Portland, just she felt enveloped in love and support. And, not only did people donate thousands and thousands of dollars to her GoFundMe, but they reached out with words of encouragement and support and love and offers of all kinds of help. So, as I said, just a really beautiful soul, and I am feel truly blessed that our paths crossed, if even for a relatively short time.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are just about at time. I want to thank Samantha Allen, Vicki Gillette, Dana Spears, and Claire all for coming today, taking time out of your day to talk about these folks that have met, have loved, have cared about, have defended. It's really important that we continue to say these names, that we continue to talk about these issues, and we continue to make it important in our daily lives. Nothing will change unless we are the ones to choose to start having these conversations, challenging people. We don't have dinner tables the same way we did before COVID, but we still have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and all of these things. Find your friends, find your family who still have space to cover in terms of getting comfortable, getting engaged with this conversation and this fight for equity and equality, and keep them engaged. So it's 1 o'clock. That is our time. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have as good a day as you can have. Thank you for sharing your pain and your vulnerability. Please take care of yourselves today. Obviously, drink water. Take a little time for yourself to get your heart where it needs to be to get through the rest of this week. Thank you.